There are several sprawling science fiction franchises built around the idea of a massive spacefaring civilization organized along vaguely feudal lines. Lords in great houses owning entire planets or star systems, duking it out with armies of armored space knights. Dune, Battletech, Warhammer 40k, while very different in detail, share the vague neo-feudal structure at the core of their worlds. Further, they all share the idea of a more advanced, more prosperous past that lasted for a long time, but eventually turned to sludge. The Dark Age that follows is a time of constant war, though often petty little affairs in comparison to what the old civilization was capable of. Stories of a stagnant, even declining civilization, salvaging what it can from its predecessor and never able to equal the achievements of the long-dead past. Like a deep cultural memory of the collapse of Rome and the centuries-long Dark Age that followed. Full of warring kingdoms, invasions, crusades, and plagues. Not that the post-Roman period was a time of universal woe and cultural decline, and the Roman Empire was absolutely vile in a lot of ways. Here I'm speaking of a Dark Age as a shorthand for a loss of technological capacity, a regression in material terms. I know I'm grossly oversimplifying it. I'm making a cultural argument rather than a historical one. What I present here isn't a thesis that I'm fully committed to. It's more pondering aloud, more questions than answers. But I do find it remarkable that in the modern era of supposedly democratic institutions, we're still drawn so strongly to the feudal ideal of wise rulers and stable class structures, to stories of disinherited princes reclaiming their birthright, the pomp of royalty, so much so that we fill that vacuum in our own society and project that feudal idea into fictional futures. If we look at the West in a broad historical context, it makes a lot of sense. Ours was a feudal culture for much longer than it's been a post-Enlightenment one with modern ideas about individual liberties and representative government. American culture is rooted in European cultures, and Europe was feudal for centuries. We don't think much of it as a socioeconomic system these days, but cultural frameworks change much slower than legal ones. Changing cultural archetypes isn't like wiping Windows and installing Linux. It's deeply rooted in how we see the world and how we see ourselves. It may be why America, a country that explicitly rejected the idea of noble bloodlines and hereditary titles, fills that vacuum by treating our industrialists, politicians, and entertainers like royalty. We're fascinated by their lives. We give their statements weight because of who they are rather than any logic or knowledge they possess, as though we have a cultural hole in the shape of a king and we fill it with the closest thing we can find. Right from the start of the country, President George Washington attended and hosted elaborate parties that were indistinguishable from a royal ball. Thomas Jefferson famously griped about this at one of these events in Philadelphia. In the 19th and 20th centuries, American industrialists lived the lavish lifestyle of royals, but also funded parks, theaters, and charities that served the public, but also stand as monuments to themselves. Like, we're still a feudal people on some cultural level, so maybe it isn't surprising that we project it out into space and the same core themes of knights, lords, and dark ages keep coming up. But what is feudalism? In broad terms, it's a socioeconomic system based on the holding and leasing of land as fiefs. Importantly, it's a contractual system. A king grants a fief to a vassal, a baron or duke or whatever, and that vassal in return provides the king with tribute and military service in the form of knights funded by the fief. It's a mutual arrangement. The baron then has some serfs who work the land on behalf of the baron in exchange for protection, again a mutual obligation even if not an equitable one. Feudal economies are agricultural. Wealth is derived from the productive capacity of the land, as opposed to capitalism, where wealth comes from the productive capacity of capital. Factories, mines, the means of making stuff. Feudalism has serfs tied to the land. Capitalism has wage laborers dependent on the market. So in Dune, for example, we have a superficially feudal system. Entire planets are fiefs of dukes and barons. Arrakis is a fief, it's specifically referred to as such. It's land that must be worked. The spice is harvested like a crop. But it also has non-feudal elements. Spice harvesting is a capital-intensive industrial process requiring big mobile harvesters to collect it and launch facilities to deliver it. The Chome Company processes spice into a tradable commodity. It's an industrial conglomerate with shares owned by the emperor and members of the great houses, stockholders in essence. Dune shows us a socioeconomic system that resembles European feudalism in many ways, but also has some traits of mercantilist or more recent capitalist systems. The same applies in Battletech, with various planet-ruling clans and great houses coexisting with corporations. Whether we call it neo-feudalism, techno-feudalism, or crony capitalism, it's a system where free markets have collapsed into tightly controlled monopolies, and the productive capacity of the society is owned by a very small percentage of the population. Essentially what the Davos crowd has been advocating. These are not particularly innovative economies, and while it might be interesting to do in-depth dives to see what we can discern about the socioeconomic systems of Dune, Battletech, and 40K individually in detail, here I'm just looking at broad strokes. All three exist within Dark Age societies. They exist in a world with a lower level of technology and productivity than existed in the past and are constantly reminded of it. All this archaeotech exists in various form, whether in written records, damaged and irreparable ships, or extremely valuable old machines carefully maintained for centuries. But such things can't be produced new, either because the knowledge is lost, or the cost is so high that the fragments of the older civilization can't bear the expense. But part of it is that technology can disrupt social hierarchies. The prohibition on thinking machines in Dune is interesting in this light. It raises the issues of human thought becoming dependent on machines and therefore controllable by those who control the machines. We see it today, whether in everyone using calculators for simple math that we really should be able to do in our heads, or lacking basic orienteering skills because everyone has GPS, up to the erosion of critical thinking and blind acceptance by many of whatever narrative mainstream news or governmental mouthpieces barf out on any given day. We collectively offload some of our thinking to machines because it saves us a lot of time. But dependence on machines is dependence on the people who control those machines. There are a lot of different ways to interpret the whole prohibition on machines in the likeness of a human mind in the Butlerian Jihad. And while the Brian Herbert, Kevin J. Anderson Dune novels are technically canon, I personally think the whole thing of a physical war against giant killer robots doesn't fit Frank Herbert's themes and world. I find it much more interesting to look at it as an intellectual struggle, a jihad in the spiritual sense, of rejecting dependence on computers, which can be both the crutch to lean on and also shackles to constrain us, in favor of developing the potential of the human mind. But that breaking free, becoming something higher, which can be seen as a metaphor for spiritual growth, gets turned around by organized religion into a system of social control. The prohibition on computers buttresses dependence on mentats, but more important in terms of societal power, on the Spacing Guild and the Bene Gesserit. You don't have to be a medievalist to see the comparison here. While the Dark Ages weren't actually a period of total technological stagnation and misery, it was a time aware of the achievements of Rome, aware of past achievements that could not be matched. The aqueducts still worked, people still relied on them, but no one was building new ones. The loss wasn't so much technology in the sense of making things, but of organizational skills and logistical capacity. Rome, the city, was still there, but the population collapsed without the imperial logistics strain that maintained it. But there it was, reminding everyone that things used to be better. Rome was both historical fact and an idealized past. Even today, we still use Latin mottos for military units, for universities, for any suitably weighty institution. Roman-style architecture is synonymous with major government or cultural institutions. In many ways, the Catholic Church is a little remnant of the late Empire still trucking along. Even now, centuries after Rome's fall, the Empire still exerts a guiding cultural influence in numerous little ways. Almost like the corpse of a god emperor propped up on a golden throne, guiding civilization as a psychic beacon in the void. And when the Roman Empire was no longer able to project power by sending legions across its territory, authority devolved to smaller units, which is similar to what we could expect if an interstellar civilization were to collapse for whatever reason. Individual worlds would become closed economies. There's nothing inherently feudal about that. They could still have the individual economies organized along various lines, dozens or hundreds of modern Earths cut off from each other. We could have Austrian school free market planet over here and Frankfurt school pinko planet over there, and they don't have to care about each other's problems. While planets reverting to actual historical agricultural feudalism while engaged in interstellar trade is sketchy, the basic idea of entire planets essentially owned by a small cabal isn't so far-fetched. Whether that cabal perpetuates itself through networking at key institutions or skips the pretense and is directly hereditary isn't really the point. A Dune-style neo-feudal interstellar empire isn't all that different from a world of nation-states run by a revolving cadre of elites who have more in common with each other than with the people of the nations they govern. There is another very different space feudalism example that needs mentioning. Paul Anderson's The High Crusade, which I recently read thanks to a recommendation here. It's the story of an extraterrestrial scout mission that lands in England in the year 1345. One of the scout party makes the mistake of shooting into a crowd of gawking Englishmen, triggering the knights and archers under the command of Baron Roger de Tourneville to go into soldier mode. They overrun the ship and kill most of the crew. The Baron thinks it's a fine idea to take the craft to the Holy Land and aid the king in the crusade, but being reliant on one of the surviving crew to teach them how it works, they get duped and taken to a colony world. But these English transplants are far more aggressive and devious than the citizens of the stable and stagnant empire they find themselves in. They sow divisions, they trigger revolts, and the attempted invasion of Earth ends up leading to the fall of an interstellar empire and the imposition of a feudal-esque society across its remnants, which 1,000 years later is encountered by men from Earth. The story is told as an account compiled by a monk, Brother Parvis, of their journey in the Baron's War. It's an interesting book, well worth a read, and I want to do a deeper dive into it at some point. It's notable in this context because rather than a spacefaring culture reverting to feudalism, it's a feudal culture suddenly becoming spacefaring. They adapt the technology to their worldview rather than developing a worldview in tandem with developing technology. It's a space feudalism framework that follows a logical course of development from its starting conditions. Sometimes we'll look at these bleak futures like Dune or May All the Powers of Good and Mercy Help Us Warhammer 40k, and contrast them with the optimistic, aspirational future of something like Star Trek. But really, it's just an earlier stage. It's utopian, while all these space feudalism stories are post-utopian. They're set in worlds where humanity progressed and rose to great heights, achieved that utopian vision only to crash down into ruin in a dark age. A stagnant world, essentially anti-growth. Dune gives a bleak vision of a society built around a self-reinforcing system of stagnant authoritarianism. Even Star Trek went this route in the third season of Discovery. The great future imploded, and now it's all a cack pile of petty warlords and narcissistic princelings with gangs of goons fighting over the scraps. As a side note, the culture from the Ian Banks series in many ways looks like a decadent society that's outsourced its work, both productive and intellectual, to sapient machines that, for whatever reason, decide to be nice to the fleshlings. The culture strikes me as the kind of society that, when it collapses, leads to the sort of dystopian world we see in Dune. I still haven't read all the culture books, but in my cranial filing system, it's shelved alongside the pre-Butlerian Jihad era of Dune or the age of technology in Warhammer, the good old days that people look back on while struggling in the world that those days created. And as I look around the world today, with economies teetering under the weight of debt, inflation, and mismanagement, while some of the wealthiest people on the planet are pushing ideologies of degrowth and stagnation, concentrating ownership of land and capital into their own hands, essentially the rise of techno-feudalism, I hope these space feudalism stories not only entertain, but also serve as a reminder that it's a dark age society. It's how humanity lives when human societies fail. Maybe that memory is so ingrained in our culture that it's forever part of who we are, and if so, I hope it serves not only as inspiration for sprawling epics of war and chivalry, but also as a warning to recognize the signs. Dark ages can be avoided if we see them coming. I want to take this moment to thank the patrons of the channel who make this kind of strange content possible, and also one of my mentors, Dr. DeWint, who showed me how hilarious some of the horrifying stories from the Middle Ages could be.